Hi, everybody. Jose Palomino with another episode of Business Growth on Purpose. And today's guest is Florian Meyer. And Florian is a fractional CFO. So he works with companies generally in that mid-market, $10 million, $20 million range and above, mostly in industrial and manufacturing categories. And he is truly a strategic financial thinker. And it's not just keeping track of the books, but it's making those big picture decisions that can actually affect the very future of your company and the success of your strategy. So listen closely as Florian joins our show right now. Well, welcome, Florian, to Business Growth on Purpose.
Well, good morning. I'm Florian Meyer, and I work for a company called Newhouse Partners, and I act as a fractional CFO or a board member for basically owner-managed private companies in a range of 10 million or more in revenue. So that's what I do for a living.
Wow, and that's exactly the kind of the target audience I tend to end up working with over the last 17 years at Value Prop. So I know those people, and I know what they're dealing with as well. But what I love about the opportunity to speak with you here today on the show, and for our audience, is the fact that we sometimes look at strategy kind of from a marketing point of view, but there's a whole financial dimension in terms of things that get into that, right? Like things people need to look at. And all too often I find that owners think financial management is they have like a monthly P&L, and they're not really looking, or they're looking at production numbers, coming from the production floor if they're in manufacturing.
Yeah.
What, in your opinion, and the work you do, and I also like to draw the sharp distinction between a CFO and a bookkeeper controller, because all too often I also run into bookkeeper controllers that are given CFO titles.
Yes, okay.
So the question is, what are some things, just for an owner listening to this, running a company like that, what are some of the things they should be thinking about having available to them, or numbers they should be looking at to help them make better decisions?
I guess I'd start by answering your first question in the sense, what's the difference between a CFO and a controller or a bookkeeper? So
Okay.
a CFO should be a big picture person. And I call myself a financial general manager. So I look at the entire business, any business that I look at, and I try to look at where are we going with that business? What do we need to change? And so I don't get overly involved in the detail of the accounting. I will make sure that the accounting makes sense. But whether we're off by a couple dollars one way or the other is not something I would do. That's something that a controller or a bookkeeper should be very concerned about. So I would say they would be much more detail-oriented than I am. And so therefore, I'm the big picture guy looking at, and I'll generally work with the president or the board, or in many cases, the owners, and say, okay, how do we move forward the business? Where we had some challenges and where there's some opportunities. And that's what I would look at with the business and get beyond just the numbers. And so for a business owner, he's saying, where am I at today? Who are my competition? And where are my unique advantages to move forward? And then I would work with the owner to make sure that we develop that strategy. And the other part, quite naturally, as a finance person, is to make sure we have the financing available, either internally or externally. It doesn't matter. But we look at both sides. Here in Canada, you're using the US market, but in the Canadian market, you've got a fairly lucrative research and development grant program from the federal government, which is also supported by so that is one way of funding a company. But there are many ways. And one example is that we had one client, they needed to buy out one of the owners, and they were looking at additional financing. What we did is we actually brought the accounts receivable to current, and now we had plenty of money in the bank to buy out one of the owners. So there's many ways of skinning the cat, but you need someone that's a big picture guy that works with the senior management and owners.
So one of the things that's, I think, kind of connected to your response that I could see right away, Florian, is knowing what's possible. Like if you're inside the machine all day, and so like you said, you're making sure the book's square and everything's being kept track of, and then owners often fear like, okay, that I have to rest the credit line after a year, or I have to do, I have my I'm the signatory on that SBA loan, or whatever those fears are. They sometimes don't really see the bigger picture, what's possible. So when you work with an owner, do you find that they really, in your experience, that they actually know what's possible, or that's the first step for them to know that it's not just go to the bank, extend your term out your line of credit, it could be a lot more sophisticated than that.
Well, one of the examples is, a company I'm working with right now is that what I said to the owner is that you've got to stop working in the business, but you've got to start working on the business. So one of the first things we did is we actually developed a 5-year plan of where we could take the business. So right now we're at $10 million, $12 million business. And we see clearly the potential to make it a $40 million business in 5 years. So there's a part of the market that is underserved that we could serve. And so what we developed was a whole new production platform to allow us to serve that market. And then one of the elements that I've worked on is to make sure we had the financing to support that expansion. And so that, there's a dramatic, so it's actually a new business for him. One he'd looked at before, but one he had not implemented. And now we're looking solidly at implementing that new strategy.
Well, what also I think can happen is, especially if a business, let's say moving from like 10 to 12, right? That's substantial growth and, percentage, about 20% year-over-year growth. They're getting busy. Now we're talking about labor shortages in any of the industrial categories that certainly the B2B categories I tend to work in. So it's hard for them to think strategically when they have to think daily so tactically. And then you say, work on your business. Michael Gerber, what E-Myth, 30 years ago talked about that, right? So, and I hear a lot of owners say that phrase, but they don't really do it. They think they're kind of doing it because they joined Vistage or something, which is fine, but they're not really doing it really. So how do, in your experience, what are some of the steps an owner should take to kind of say, I got to elevate so I can see more of what's possible, and yet the business needs me to figure out stuff day to day? What's kind of the interim step? Because I don't think that's just flipping a switch.
No, part of it is to recognize clearly what is his unique talent, and we try to get him to focus on that unique talent. And so in this case where I'm talking about, his unique talent is selling.
Okay.
And so we should make sure that there's the other parts of the business, the production, the accounting, all, and to some extent the marketing, all is taken care of by other people. And then he can back himself up with some additional sales support, but he becomes the key salesperson for the business and not just managing everything that goes on, because that won't work. So you just got to step back and the first element is to say, what is he uniquely or she uniquely skilled at? And let that person focus on that.
Right. So they have a contribution to make, but and also some of the things their hands are on, maybe if they could get some honest feedback from the team, maybe the team would appreciate their hands weren't so into those pies as well, because they're not always the best at everything, although they may have started the business and they had to do everything.
Well, I would say, fortunately and unfortunately for some people, I'm fairly straightforward and honest. And so if that feedback is required, they'll get it from me.
Okay.
And I say openly to clients is, if they don't want that honest feedback to allow them to move forward, then don't engage me. That's okay. Right. Because, there's many businesses out there and many of them won't succeed, unfortunately, for a number of reasons. And I would say most often it's because senior management won't allow all the employees to do what they can do best and get out of micromanaging.
Right. So the culture isn't really, it's a micromanagement culture versus an empowerment culture.
That's right. That's right.
Right.
And, one example is I had one of my clients, I'm on the board of that client. And as we rolled into COVID, we knew that we were going to slow down. And I simply said to the board and senior management, we now have time to think. So what's the first thing we want to do? I'm not sure at the end of the day, it was the first thing we should have done. But what we did is we rejigged all of our manufacturing. And so we ordered some equipment to allow us to dramatically change how we would produce in the future. And that process started almost a little over 2 years ago. The large equipment that we ordered has just been installed.
Wow.
And so what we should have done in hindsight was probably do the marketing study first. We're doing that now.
Okay.
At least we're doing those things to allow us. So tomorrow we'll be a completely different company and much more successful.
Right. But it's interesting. And this goes to something that's, that we're all in every business living today, which is supply chain challenges. So here you are 2 years ago looking at increased capacity, and it took almost 2 years to bring it online. And I'm sure it wasn't for lack of desire or effort or whatever.
Well, It was a 2-year order time for that piece of equipment.
Well, just think about that, right? So like, imagine coming to that decision now, it push you out to 2024, 25,
Yep.
and who knows, right? So that also means taking some risks, right? The reality is strategy is decisions, and decisions you can't have perfect information. We cannot see the future. So how do you advise, leadership teams in terms of how to balance risk reward? What is it, just based on their personal disposition? Like some people are very risk averse, other people are very, caution to the wind, or is there some approach that you recommend people take so they can make a decision that doesn't bankrupt them, but at the same time allows them to pursue growth aggressively?
Well, what we did is basically the manufacturing strategy we ended up with was a 3-pronged strategy. So the first one was ordering this $3 million plus piece of equipment, which would take 2 years to get, which is now here. After that, we did several other steps. And what we did in all cases, we looked at what was the benefit of ordering equipment and would they pay for it themselves. And then the second element of that, which was a little unusual because I was on the board, not the CFO, is I actually went out to the bank. I looked at 3 banks, the existing bank and 2 other banks, and made sure we had the financing available to finance that growth. So long before we spent the money, we had the $10 million in the bank or available to allow us, because we didn't have that before, to allow us to put a lease in place for 100% of the cost. And we also knew that the benefit of the machinery would pay for itself very quickly.
Right. So that's a situation where you need to know that you have the ongoing, operational working capital. It's not just having new machine installed, and that you can't buy supplies, you can't staff it, you can't, what good is it at that point? You've bought a paperweight, a giant paperweight, but a paperweight nonetheless.
Yes. Yeah. So you have to look at the whole picture and say, okay, can we, how does that machine benefit us? And what it did is it expanded, as you said, expanded our capacity, and it also expanded our ability to diversify into different related but different products. So it was a big win-win. And on some of the other equipment we bought, some of them are robots. So they're going to replace some of the people, unfortunately. But the staff know that the change is going to cause some displacement of some people. And on that side, we've also looked at, who would we likely displace? What would it likely cost us? And what outplacement can we offer to make that transition as seamless as possible? Because that's what we're trying to do. We're not trying to be difficult for people. We recognize that some are keepers and some are not. And the ones that aren't, we're going to do our best to make sure they're reemployed somewhere else.
Well, it's interesting because like in manufacturing, I think there's a stat, a recent interview told me, and I assume it's correct, that by 2028, 5-6 years from now, there'll be 2.5 million, and this is US based, 2.5 million US manufacturing jobs that will go unfilled just because of the way the labor pool is shaping up right now. So here, that is what I hear again and again is the biggest challenge, is finding skilled labor to make the stuff that people want to buy. So from a financial planning point of view, like you say, okay, well, let's say that's true, and it's not going to change in your locality. Like you can't will the workers into existence. So, but you can order some robots, right? But that's not trivial. That's that's CapEx, that's OpEx, it's a way of working and a whole new thing. So how do you help somebody transition, like come to grips with those facts? So do you still have owners thinking, well, the labor, they'll come back. We'll get the people we need, kind of in denial of what's happening everywhere. So how do you help them shift into thinking about what we really, really got to do, even if it's not something they prefer to do?
Well, I guess what we've done is we've evaluated all of our staff to their skill level. We've also advised them that there will be changes. And so we want to see, I would say more so than anything, we want to see people that are willing to work and learn. Mm-hmm. So if they're willing to work and learn and we'll empower them to do some of that activity, then we can do the training to allow them, because some of this equipment, it's actually easier to operate than some of the older equipment. Some of the older equipment did need some unique skills, which we are having trouble filling. Some of the newer equipment, it's a bunch of buttons you push. Not that I could do it. Right. So I would say the training on some of that newer stuff is probably less difficult, but it's more, we want staff that are willing to do their very best, enjoy what they're doing, and be solid contributors. And if they've got those skills, then they're keepers.
Well, one of the things that I I run into talking to a lot of different people for our show is manufacturing has had a reputation for a long time of being, what is it, a dark, dirty, and dangerous, right? And modern manufacturing really isn't that now, and it is a path for a lot of young people that they should be pursuing instead of, with all due apologies to people who are English lit majors, maybe a bigger ROI than being an English lit major, unless that's your passion and that's what you're going to do at an academic level. So my question to you is, have you seen much in the way of on-the-job training programs growing to fill that need? Like people saying, hey, I can't find them. I gotta create the opportunity and commit resources that a decade ago I didn't have to. I could bring them in ready to go. Now I gotta help train them to be ready to go.
Well, I would say in this one company, we spent a fair amount of effort to identify who are the best people, because of the total staffing that we have in the company, let's say it'll go down to 75%. So 25%, unfortunately, will become surplus. Okay. And so we're saying with that 75%, we've actually put together programs to allow them to better understand what they're doing, understand why they're doing it, because in some cases, we're actually producing stuff that's fairly tight tolerances. So they need to understand their own measurement capabilities, not just waiting for the inspector to come by. So we're doing a fair amount of training. And so we actually have a separate department, inspector department, that will work with the staff to make sure they understand why they're doing it and how they can do it more effectively. And in this case, the president's door is always open. He said, if you have an issue, I'm here. And we'll do our very best to make sure we solve that issue. We're not going to cover it up. So
well, and that goes back to, I mean, it can be cliche, but if it's meant sincerely, I think it can work, which is win-wins, right? There's things the company needs to do, but it doesn't have to be crushing on an employee. It could actually make for a better workplace. It could be more interesting. A lot of times workers want to learn something new because they're doing the same thing for 10 years. They're actually bored. I mean, that sets in after a while. So that's interesting. So one thing that's changed a lot, and I think this last 2 years really highlighted it, ever since Elihu Goldratt wrote the Goal, and people started thinking about supply chains more strategically, 30, 40 years ago. And obviously there were other, Deming and all of that before that. Everybody started going to like very just in time, very lean inventories, and always assuming that the other guy further down the link of my supply chain will have what they need in buffer. So, and I think from a financial engineering point of view, there's a lot of companies that fell into like, well, I don't want to tie up my balance sheet with inventory, so I'll just be as lean as possible. And it was like musical chairs in the last 2 years, the music stopped. And then we realized everybody downstream was doing the same thing. How do you see that coming back? How do you see the idea of inventory as a strategic asset? And it does consume capital, right? There's no way around that. How do you see companies responding to that? Are they just waiting out this current like supply chain tightness and say, oh, I'll get back to normal, it'll be fine? Or are they strategically planning for, I'll never be caught in that position again? And what can they realistically do? Because you can't have a year of inventory on everything you might need, or else you'd have no balance sheet then left. I mean, it'd all be non-cash assets at that point.
Well, I would say I've got two examples here. One is the owner of one of the businesses recognized, and he produces fairly large pieces of equipment, $1 million a piece. He recognized that there would be a shortage. And so he pre-bought some of the stuff that he would need to allow him to still produce, whereas competitors would not be able to produce. So that was one element. So we did actually improve or increase the amount of inventory for a short period of time, which is probably 2 or 3 years. On the other side, I have another client that what we did is we looked at how many SKUs do we make, and are there SKUs that we're making that we don't make any money on? And so and we actually had our meeting yesterday. So they talked about what are the component parts, and can we reduce the number of component parts we make, and therefore produce less products, longer production runs, and therefore more profitable end profit. And so, and with that, we'll also be able to reduce the amount of inventory, because some of the inventory we have, as you said, if we produce, let's say, a widget, in some cases to produce it, we have to do 2 years of supply. Well, it's got to sit in the balance sheet for 2 years. So we're saying, is it really worth the 2 years of inventory? And so part of that will now become a marketing question. We'll say, will the clients pay a premium for us to have that for 2 years? And if the answer is no, then that product will disappear.
Well, and that could also be an opportunity to reach out to the client is, would you like us to stock this for you? And here's the program, or, some version of having the client bear the risk or bear a larger share of the risk.
Yeah. And we didn't do that in the past. And that's what we saw this year is our margin was going to zero. Our net profit was going to zero. And we said, okay, how do we change that? And we're saying we can't be all things to all people and still be profitable. If you don't make a profit, you can't stay in business.
Well, right. That is that rule, about that. That is absolutely true. So I guess just to round out, and Florian, thank you. This is a great conversation. I think anyone listening there's a lot of nuggets in here that I think are major takeaways for anyone thinking through what they might have to do next. This is too big a topic to really cover thoroughly, but I do want to just touch on it, which is the approach to pricing. You alluded to marketing, right?
Yep.
You need to have some insights into what things are worth to your customers. I still see customers, and candidly, I'm talking about $10, $20 million operations, still doing some version of cost plus pricing and not any kind of value pricing. So when you run into that, if you do run into it, how do you get people to embrace, because it is more complicated to do value-based pricing, but that's part of what it is, I think, is people just find it easier to say, it cost me X, I'll just throw 30% on it, 40%, 100% on it, whatever it is. But how would you tell an owner that they have to look at this in a much more comprehensive way?
Well, that's what I say when this one example, Jose, is that we looked at the manufacturing strategy first, and in essence, we should have looked at the marketing strategy first. And that should have dictated what kind of machinery we would buy. So hopefully we bought the right equipment. But I would say, and that more goes back into your area of expertise, is that you need to go survey your customers, survey that are non-customers, survey people you've lost. In this one case, we discovered that we've actually lost. So our sales have gone up, but our unit sales have gone down. So we've lost market share in the market. And so we have to understand, why did we lose market share? And what products does our customers want from us as opposed to what products we give them? And we're saying they're probably not right. And funnily enough, in that client, I've been asking since day one, which is many years ago, what is our product development strategy? So if you don't have that market research to say what your clients want, then it's going to be very difficult for you to understand what new products you should bring to the market. And I kind of go back to the 3M model, where they say a percentage of their sales has to be new product. And I think that's what every business has to look at, is that a percentage of your sales going forward have to represent new products you brought to market. Because unfortunately, the market's changing so quickly that everyone else is going to eat your lunch if you're not moving forward.
Right. And what's interesting, sometimes in shrinking markets, you could have growing sales. Like, I'm sure, like towards the end, some buggy whip manufacturer was getting a real growth because there was a few that remained, right? So they're saying, wow, life is wonderful. We're selling more buggy whips than ever until the music stops, and then it's over. And that's so having that insight is really powerful. Well, Florian, first of all, thanks again for just stopping by at Business Growth on Purpose. We really appreciate it. And if somebody listening to this wanted to know more about you, what you do, how to get in touch with you, where would you direct them?
So I do have a website. It's not that active, but it's there. So it's newhousepartners.com. I also am on LinkedIn, and I think both at Newhouse and Florian Meyer. And you can reach out to me at Florian, I think it's Florian Meyer or F Meyer at newhousepartners.com. And my telephone number is here in Toronto is 416-873-8684. And so, there's many ways to get a hold of me, and initial discussion, there's no cost. And just to understand what I do is I'm quite willing to speak to anybody to give that understanding.
Fantastic.
And thank you very much for the opportunity.
No, absolutely. Our pleasure here, Florian. Thank you again, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Business Growth on Purpose. If you like the show, hit subscribe and leave us a review to help other people find the podcast. And if you're ready to take the next step in driving intentional growth for your business, come check out what we're doing at valueprop.com. We've developed industry-leading programs and systems to help B2B owners take control of their growth. Until then, thanks for listening to another episode of Business Growth on Purpose.